Welcome, beautiful souls. Hit subscribe to join us on this amazing journey. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and the time in your country. Like the video to support our channel. It was supposed to be a perfect winter day. The kind you dream about. A frozen lake under a gray sky, with the air so cold it stung your lungs. We were just a group of friends, excited for a day of ice skating. There was Mia, always fearless, Jordan, the joker, Sam, the cautious one, and me, the observer who rarely spoke but noticed everything. The ice was pristine, smooth and inviting, stretching endlessly across the lake. There wasn't another soul in sight, just the eerie quiet of the woods surrounding us. As we laced up our skates, Mia teased Sam for hesitating. "Come on, Sam, it's solid," she said, stomping her foot on the ice. The sound echoed, hollow but firm. We started skating, laughing and chasing each other. It felt like freedom, until I heard it. At first it was faint, like the wind shifting under the ice. A murmur. I stopped mid-glide, my breath hanging in the air. "Did you hear that?" I asked. They laughed it off, said I was imagining things. But the whispers grew louder. They weren't random. They were words, faint but unmistakable. My name. Ella. It sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to shake it off, thinking the cold was messing with my head. Then Jordan stopped suddenly, his face pale. "Okay, not funny. Who just whispered my name?" We froze, looking at each other. No one had spoken. The wind picked up, a low howl that seemed to come from beneath us. The ice cracked softly, the sound spreading in jagged lines like something was moving under the surface. Mia, always bold, skated toward the center, laughing nervously. "Guys, stop being paranoid. It's just ice." That's when it happened. The cracks formed a perfect circle around her, spiraling outward like a spider web. She screamed as the ice trembled beneath her feet. We skated toward her, but the voices grew louder, angry now, insistent. My name, Jordan's, Sam's, over and over, like a chant. The whispers weren't random anymore. They were commanding. "Leave. Now." Mia froze, her breath fogging the air, and pointed to the ice below her. "There's something down there." We all looked. Shadows moved beneath the surface, writhing like they were alive. Hands, so many hands, pressed against the ice, their fingers clawing upward, desperate to break through. Panic set in. Jordan grabbed Mia's arm, yanking her away from the cracking circle, but the ice wasn't done with us. A deafening crack echoed, and the ice split into jagged patterns, separating us. Sam screamed, his voice cutting through the chaos. He was on his knees staring at the ice beneath him. "They're pulling me," he cried. I skated toward him, but the ice felt alive, shifting and breaking to block my path. Beneath him, pale faces stared up, mouths open in silent screams. A hand shot through the ice and grabbed his ankle, yanking him downward. I lunged, grabbing his arms, but it was like trying to hold on to ice itself, freezing and slick. He was gone in seconds, swallowed by the lake. We didn't wait. Mia, Jordan, and I scrambled toward the shore, the ice cracking and groaning with every step. The whispers turned into screams, inhuman, guttural, and deafening. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel something chasing us, the cold seeping into my bones. We made it to the shore, collapsing in the snow. The lake was quiet again, the surface smooth and unbroken, as if nothing had happened. But Sam was gone. I don't skate anymore. I can't even look at frozen lakes without hearing the whispers, my name echoing in my mind. Some nights I hear it even now, faint and chilling. Ella. And I know they're still there, waiting. It was the kind of cold that stung your lungs when you breathed. The lake stretched out like a mirror, solid and unbroken, reflecting the silvery light of a full December moon. I'd always been warned about fishing out there at night, but like the others, I laughed it off. After all, the fish were biting, and the ice was thick. What could go wrong? We'd set up our shanties in a tight circle near the center of the frozen expanse. There were 6 of us, all seasoned ice fishers. The cold brought us together, yet the night had a strange stillness to it, something beyond the chill. Even the wind seemed to whisper warnings I couldn't quite make out. The first disappearance happened just after midnight. Tom's shanty was gone. No cracks in the ice, no tracks in the snow, just a dark, empty spot where it had stood, and a faint red smear trailing toward the edge of the lake. We all stood there staring, hearts pounding. Tom's tackle box, his chair, even his lantern, all gone as if they'd been swallowed whole. Weird, muttered Eddie, but his voice cracked. He tried to laugh it off. Probably just a prank. But deep down, we all knew better. We decided to stick close together, dragging our shanties into a tighter cluster. We didn't talk much after that. The silence felt heavier, the kind that presses down on you until it's hard to breathe. I swore I heard faint knocking sounds beneath the ice, but when I mentioned it, no one answered. Their faces were pale, their eyes darting around like cornered animals. By 2 a.m., Eddie's shanty was gone. I'll never forget the look on Joe's face when he found the blood streak leading away from Eddie's spot. It wasn't just a smear this time. It was a pattern, like something had been dragged under the ice. My stomach churned when I realized there were scratch marks too, claw-like grooves etched into the surface. Eddie had been trying to hold on. "Let's go," Joe said, his voice trembling. "Pack up. We're leaving." We hurried, fumbling with frozen fingers, but it was like the lake didn't want us to go. Every time we looked away, something shifted. My shanty felt like it was farther from the others, though I hadn't moved it. The ice cracked beneath my feet, not enough to break, but enough to make me jump every time. And then came the sounds. The knocking was louder now, a relentless thud, 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 like someone, or something, was trying to punch its way out from below. At first I thought it was my imagination, but the others heard it too. Their wide eyes and shaking hands told me they were as scared as I was. Joe screamed next. I turned just in time to see his shanty vanish, sucked down so fast it left a hole in the ice. His scream echoed, muffled, as if the lake had swallowed it whole. Blood streaked the surface, brighter and fresher than before. I ran. The others were gone now. Bill, Mark, vanished into the abyss, their shanties leaving behind nothing but dark, empty patches and those cursed red smears. The knocking grew louder, more frantic, like it was following me. My boots slid on the ice, my breath fogging up the night. I didn't stop until I hit the shore, collapsing into the snow. When I looked back, the lake was still, silent. The moonlight gleamed off its surface, mocking me. Not a single shanty remained, not even mine. I don't ice fish anymore. Every December I hear the stories, people disappearing, shanties vanishing. And every December I hear the knocking, faint but persistent, under my floorboards. I know it's calling me back, but I'll never go. Not again. It started with the warnings. Every winter, the old man by the gas station would mutter the same thing. "Stay off the black ice. It don't just break. It swallows." We laughed it off. Legends like that are part of every small town, right? But this year, curiosity got the better of us. There were 4 of us. Me, Jake, Sarah, and Liv. Jake had heard about the black ice patch from his uncle, who swore someone vanished there decades ago. Liv, always the skeptic, said it was just an old wives' tale to scare kids. Sarah didn't want to go, but we convinced her. We all did stupid things when we were bored. The lake was colder than I'd ever felt it. The wind cut through our jackets like knives. We walked under a moon so bright it made the ice glow, turning the frozen lake into a glittering sea. But the center of the lake was different. Darker. Duller. There it was. The black ice. It looked wrong. Like something alive. It didn't sparkle or reflect. It just absorbed. Jake was the first to step closer. "It's just ice," he said, tapping it with his boot. The sound echoed, deeper than it should have. Liv rolled her eyes and marched onto it, daring us to follow. "I told you, nothing's—" Her voice cut off. She froze mid-step. "Liv?" Sarah's voice was shaky. Liv stood there, her eyes wide, staring straight ahead. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. We all listened, but the only sound was the wind. Then it came. Low, faint at first, like humming under the ice. It grew louder, clearer. Voices, hundreds of voices. Jake laughed nervously. "All right, you got us. Great prank." Liv didn't move. "It's not me," she whispered, her breath fogging up. "They're under the ice." Before we could process what she said, the ice beneath her foot began to crack. Not like normal cracks. It spread in black veins, spidering outward, forming symbols, patterns. "Liv, get back!" I yelled, grabbing for her arm. But the ice broke beneath her and she disappeared. Just gone. The scream caught in my throat. No splash, no struggle. She just vanished into the blackness. For a second, we all stared in stunned silence until Jake yelled, "Liv!" He dropped to his knees, pounding the ice where she'd been. "We've got to help her, she's under there." But when we looked closer, it wasn't water below the ice. It was darkness, an endless abyss that seemed to pull at us. Then we heard it. A voice, Liv's voice, muffled and distorted, echoing from beneath. "Help me," it said, weak and desperate. "It's cold. So cold." Sarah started sobbing. "We need to leave. This isn't right." But Jake didn't listen. He stepped onto the black ice, shouting for Liv. The moment his foot touched it, the symbols glowed again. His scream was cut short as he too was pulled under. I grabbed Sarah's arm. "Run!" We turned to leave, but the ice started cracking behind us. The voices were everywhere now, calling our names, pleading for us to join them. A hand, pale, blue, skeletal, broke through the ice, reaching for my ankle. I kicked it away, dragging Sarah with me. We ran until the shore was in sight, but the voices didn't stop. They followed us, whispering, laughing, crying. As we reached the edge of the lake, Sarah tripped. When I turned to help her up, her face was pale, her eyes wide. "They're here," she whispered. I looked back. The black ice wasn't just in the center anymore. It was spreading across the entire lake, consuming everything in its path. We didn't stop running until we were miles away. To this day, I don't know what happened to Jake and Liv. Their bodies were never found. The police blamed thin ice. But every winter I hear their voices in my dreams whispering from the frozen lake. And now I never go near the black ice, because it doesn't just break, it swallows. It started with a song, soft, almost too faint to notice, but it was there, a melody carried by the icy December wind. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The frozen lake had always been eerily quiet, surrounded by skeletal trees and a bitter chill that gnawed at your bones. But this year, the silence was broken. I was walking my dog, Milo, near the lake when I heard it for the first time. A faint, childlike hum drifting from the direction of the frozen waters. It wasn't joyful, though. It was slow, mournful, almost like a lullaby twisted into something wrong. Milo froze, ears perked, a low growl rumbling in his throat. My breath caught in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing across the barren expanse. The wind picked up, carrying the melody away, leaving only the sound of my pounding heart. The next night, I couldn't help myself. Curiosity pulled me back to the lake like a tether. I told myself it was just the wind or maybe kids messing around, but deep down, I knew better. The moment I stepped onto the frozen shore, the singing returned. This time it was louder, closer. My skin prickled as I scanned the lake's surface. Shadows moved beneath the ice, shapes that weren't there before. The locals had always whispered about the lake. A century ago, a school bus full of children had skidded off the icy road and plunged into the freezing water. None of them survived. They said you could hear their cries on cold December nights if you listened closely. I never believed those stories. Until now. The melody grew clearer, distinct voices harmonizing in a chilling, otherworldly tune. I couldn't see anyone, but I felt them. Dozens of unseen eyes watching me. My legs trembled, but I couldn't look away. Then I saw them. Tiny footprints appeared on the ice, forming in the frost right before my eyes. One by one, they etched closer to the center of the lake. I wanted to run, but my feet were rooted to the ground, like the cold had crept into my bones. The footprints stopped, and then the ice began to crack. A girl emerged. Her hair was plastered to her face, her skin a ghastly pale blue. Her eyes, wide and lifeless, locked onto mine. She opened her mouth, and the song poured out, a haunting, high-pitched wail that made my ears ring. More figures surfaced behind her, their tiny hands pressed against the ice as they clawed their way out. "Come play," she whispered, her voice soft yet piercing, like a knife cutting through the silence. I stumbled back, my breath coming in panicked gasps. Milo barked furiously, but he wouldn't step onto the ice. The girl tilted her head, her smile too wide, too unnatural. The other children circled her, their voices rising in a chorus that made my stomach churn. Then they began to move toward me. I turned and ran, the sound of shattering ice following me like footsteps. The melody grew louder, chasing me, until I reached the safety of the trees. When I looked back, the lake was still, silent. No footprints, no cracks, nothing to suggest what I had just seen. That night, I couldn't sleep. The song played over and over in my head, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces. By morning, I decided I had to warn someone. But when I returned to the lake with the sheriff, there was no sign of anything unusual, except for the footprints, mine, leading to the edge of the lake, and theirs, a trail that disappeared beneath the ice. The sheriff didn't believe me. No one did. But every night since, I've heard their song, growing louder. And tonight, it's coming from my backyard. The snow crunched under my boots as I trudged along the edge of the frozen lake, the wind biting at my face like needles. I wasn't even supposed to be out here this late, but something about the stillness of the lake always drew me in. Tonight, though, the stillness felt different, heavier, as if the cold air carried a warning I couldn't quite understand. That's when I saw him. A man, hunched over, sitting on a rock at the edge of the lake, his head bowed low. His clothes were ragged and frostbitten, his skin an unnatural shade of pale blue. He didn't seem to notice me at first, just stared blankly at the frozen water as if waiting for something, or someone. "Hey!" I called out, my voice echoing eerily across the ice. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" His head snapped up so suddenly it made my breath catch. His eyes locked onto mine, cold, hollow, and lifeless. But there was something else in them, something that sent a shiver down my spine, a quiet desperation, like he was pleading with me without saying a word. "I'm waiting for her," he said, his voice brittle and rasping, like dry leaves crushed underfoot. I took a cautious step closer, my instincts screaming at me to turn back. "Who are you waiting for? Do you need me to call someone?" He didn't answer. Instead, he pointed a trembling finger toward the lake. His hand was skeletal, the fingers blackened with frostbite. "She's down there," he whispered. "She promised she'd come back." I followed his gaze, but all I saw was the frozen expanse of the lake, its surface cracked and jagged in places, as if it had been clawed at from underneath. I tried to steady my breathing, but my chest felt tight, like the air itself had turned to ice. "You can't stay out here," I said, taking another step closer. "You'll freeze to death." He laughed then, a sound so dry and broken it didn't seem human. "I already have." My blood ran cold. I took a step back, and the snow shifted under my weight. "What are you talking about?" "She'll come for you, too," he said, his eyes boring into mine. "She always does." Before I could respond, a sudden sharp crack echoed across the lake. My head whipped around, and I saw a dark shape moving under the ice, slithering like a shadow caught between worlds. It darted beneath the surface, coming closer and closer to the shore. My heart hammered in my chest. "Who's out there?" I shouted, my voice shaking. "She is," the man said, his voice now calm, almost reverent. "She doesn't like to wait." I turned back to him, but he was gone. The rock where he had been sitting was empty, the frost-covered ground undisturbed. My breath came in shallow gasps as I scanned the area, but there was no trace of him, as if he had never been there at all. The cracking sound grew louder, closer. The shape under the ice stopped directly in front of me, and I swear I saw a hand, a pale, clawed hand, press against the surface from below. My feet refused to move, frozen as the ice beneath me began to groan and shift. Then I heard it. A voice, faint and echoing, calling my name. I stumbled backward, the ground beneath me trembling as the ice began to splinter. I turned and ran, not daring to look back, the sound of cracking ice and that haunting voice chasing me all the way back to the tree line. I never went back to the lake. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear that voice calling me again, soft and insistent, promising that she'll come for me too, and I believe her. It started with a dare. We were explorers, sure, but the kind who chase thrills more than mysteries. The frozen lake, known locally as Whispering Depths, had been off limits for decades. Rumors swirled about people disappearing beneath its icy surface, never to be seen again. When we heard about the strange sonar readings suggesting an ancient structure beneath the ice, curiosity overpowered caution. The air was deathly cold when we arrived, our breath visible in thick, misty puffs. The lake stretched out like a shimmering glass sheet, its surface eerily smooth. It didn't crack or groan like frozen lakes usually do. It was silent, unnaturally so. Even the wind seemed to avoid it. The stillness made my skin crawl, but no one spoke of turning back. We set up our gear and drilled into the ice, each vibration through the auger sending a sickening hum into the void below. As the ice gave way, we saw it. Dark, ancient spires jutting up from the lake bed, sharp and angular like nothing from this world. I felt the first twinge of unease then, like eyes were on us from every direction. "Looks like a fortress," Josh whispered, his voice trembling despite the brave smirk he tried to wear. He leaned too close to the hole, and I swore I saw something move beneath the water, something pale, long, and skeletal. "No jokes," I snapped, but he swore he wasn't joking. We lowered a drone into the water, its light cutting through the blackness. What we saw on the monitor shouldn't have been possible. Ornate carvings, still sharp and detailed, despite centuries submerged. Strange runes, alien and hypnotic, seemed to pulse faintly on the walls. The silence around us deepened. My heart raced as if the lake itself were alive, waiting. "Let's go," Sarah whispered, her face pale. She was the most fearless of us, always eager for adventure, but even she looked shaken. That's when we heard it, a soft rhythmic tapping from beneath the ice, faint at first, then louder, echoing around us like an amplified heartbeat. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming closer. I wanted to run. My body screamed for me to move, but my feet felt frozen to the spot. The tapping turned into a dragging sound, and then came the whispers. They weren't words, not really, just a low murmur that burrowed into my skull, promising something. I glanced at Josh and Sarah, their faces pale and contorted, their eyes wide with terror. Before I could react, the ice cracked. Just a hairline fracture, but enough to send panic surging through us. We scrambled back, but the fracture spread, revealing dark shapes beneath the surface. At first, they looked like shadows, but then they moved. Slow, deliberate, and far too human. "They're watching us," Sarah hissed, tears streaming down her face. The first figure emerged from the ice with a sickening lurch, its head tilted unnaturally to the side, as if it had been broken and set wrong. Its eyes were black pits, its body covered in frostbitten, decaying flesh. More followed, each dragging itself onto the surface with jerky, inhuman movements. Their mouths hung open, letting out a guttural, wet rasp that made my stomach churn. "Run!" I screamed, but it was too late. The figures moved faster than I thought possible, their bony hands clawing at us with relentless hunger. Josh was the first to fall, dragged screaming into the hole we had drilled. His voice was cut off abruptly, leaving nothing but the sickening sound of ice crunching and water sloshing. Sarah and I ran, our boots slipping on the frozen surface. The lake seemed alive, cracks spiderwebbing toward us as if herding us back to the center. I looked over my shoulder once, just once, and regretted it instantly. The figures were multiplying, their grotesque faces locked in expressions of rage and hunger. We barely made it to the shore, the last sound behind us being the ice sealing itself again, as if nothing had ever happened. No one believed us when we returned. They said Josh fell through thin ice, a tragic accident. But I know the truth. I hear the whispers every night, calling me back to the lake. And I know someday I won't be able to resist. The prison beneath the ice never lets its secrets go. The air was bitterly cold, the kind that stings your lungs with every breath. I wrapped my scarf tighter and made my way toward the lake. The stories I'd heard about the phantom ice fisher had always been nothing more than drunken ramblings around the bar or campfire tales meant to spook the gullible. But tonight, I wasn't sure anymore. Something felt off. The lake stretched out like an endless sheet of glass, shimmering under the pale light of a full moon. The village had been eerily quiet all day, and now standing on the frozen shore I understood why. There he was, a lone figure in the middle of the lake, hunched over a hole he'd drilled into the ice. He didn't move, didn't seem to notice me. I don't know what compelled me to step onto the ice, but I did. My boots creaked against the frozen surface, the sound echoing louder than it should have. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. The figure wasn't dressed for the weather. His clothes looked tattered, soaked, and frozen stiff against his body. His hands worked mechanically, drilling hole after hole even though no fishing lines hung from them. "Hey!" I called, my voice trembling. "Are you all right?" He didn't answer. Instead, his head tilted slightly, just enough for me to see the side of his face. My stomach turned. His skin was pale blue, almost translucent, and his eyes, they were hollow, like staring into deep, frozen wells. I should have turned back then, but curiosity or stupidity urged me forward. "Sir, it's dangerous out here," I tried again. The ice beneath me groaned, a low, guttural sound that vibrated in my chest. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. Then he moved. Slowly, his head turned to face me fully. His mouth twisted into a grotesque smile that didn't reach his eyes, which remained black voids. "She's down there," he whispered, his voice raspy and wet, as though water gurgled in his throat. "I just need one more to bring her back." My breath caught. "What are you talking about?" He pointed to the hole he'd just drilled. The water was impossibly dark, but something moved beneath the surface. Something pale and slow. I stepped back, my boots slipping slightly on the ice. "Do you hear her?" he asked, his voice rising. His head snapped toward me with unnatural speed. "She's calling for me. But the ice always takes them first." I didn't hear anything, but the way he stared at the hole made my skin crawl. Suddenly, the sound of cracking ice filled the air, sharp and loud. I looked down and my blood ran cold. The cracks were spreading outward, spindly veins racing toward me. "You'll do," he said, his grin widening. Before I could react, he lunged. His icy hands clamped around my ankle, and I felt a piercing cold seep into my bones. I screamed, kicking wildly, and managed to free myself just as the ice beneath him shattered completely. He plunged into the freezing water, his hollow eyes locked onto mine as he disappeared. I scrambled backward, my heart racing, but it wasn't over. The cracks continued spreading, and from each hole he'd drilled, something was rising, skeletal hands, clawing at the surface, pulling themselves out. They weren't human anymore if they ever had been. Their faces were twisted, their mouths open in silent screams, water pouring from their eye sockets. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the shore, and even then, I didn't dare look back. The next morning I told the villagers what I'd seen, but they only shook their heads. "Everyone who sees him says the same thing," one old man muttered. "You're lucky to be alive." But I don't feel lucky. Every night since I've dreamed of that lake, of his smile, and I know deep down that he's still out there, drilling holes, waiting for the next unlucky soul. It started as a dare. We were all gathered at Finn's cabin by the lake, the air heavy with the sharp chill of December. The lake, they said, held secrets, stories about shadows that moved beneath its frozen surface. I laughed it off. Ghost stories to pass the time, I thought. But when Finn turned to me, his grin mischievous, and said, "Bet you won't walk across it," I couldn't say no. The ice cracked under my boots as I stepped onto it, the sound reverberating in the silent night. The lake stretched endlessly, reflecting the dim light of the crescent moon. My breath formed small clouds as I moved forward, each step making me feel more exposed. The others stood at the shore, their figures shrinking as I walked further away. Halfway across I saw it, a dark smear beneath the ice, shifting like ink in water. I froze, my heart hammering. It wasn't a fish. It was too large, too deliberate. The shadow pulsed, and I could swear it looked up at me. That's when the whispers began. They weren't loud, just faint murmurs at first, like someone speaking in the next room. I strained to make out the words, but they were garbled, unintelligible. My chest tightened, and I wanted to turn back, but my feet wouldn't move. The shadow was circling beneath me now, slower, as if it knew I was afraid. I dropped to my knees, trying to get a better look. My breath fogged the ice, but when I wiped it away, I wished I hadn't. Faces stared back at me, dozens of them, their eyes wide and mouths open in silent screams. Their features were distorted, frozen in the ice, yet somehow alive. I scrambled back, panic setting in. My foot hit a soft patch and the ice groaned. That's when I realized the shadows weren't just beneath the ice, they were inside it. Long, claw-like fingers stretched toward me, pressing against the surface as if they could break free. The whispers turned to cries, sharp, desperate wails that echoed in my head. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I saw myself, not standing on the ice, but beneath it, frozen, my mouth open in the same silent scream as the others. I screamed and ran, my boots slipping as I bolted toward the shore. Every step felt like a lifetime, the shadow chasing me, its form stretching and twisting under my feet. The ice cracked louder now, the sound splitting the air like a gunshot. When I reached the shore, I collapsed, gasping for air. Finn and the others rushed to me, but their faces told me everything. I turned back toward the lake, and my blood ran cold. The shadow wasn't under the ice anymore. It was standing on top of it, a tall black figure with no face, just emptiness where its features should be. It didn't move, but I could feel it watching me. I could feel it waiting. We left that night, driving back to the city in silence. No one talked about what we saw, but I know they felt it too. The weight of something watching us, something following. Now, every time I close my eyes, I see that shadow. I hear the whispers. And I know someday soon, I'll hear the ice cracking beneath my feet again. I've always loved the stillness of winter. There's something magical about skating alone at dawn when the lake is veiled in mist, and the only sound is the scrape of my blades on the ice. But this year was different. It started the morning after the first freeze. I was tying my skates when I noticed something, or someone, out of the corner of my eye. A figure stood at the far end of the lake, barely visible through the fog. They didn't move, just watched. I called out, but my voice disappeared into the silence. When I looked again, they were gone. I shook it off, probably just another skater. But as I took to the ice, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The air felt heavier, the ice colder. My blades carved smooth arcs, but every time I glanced at the glassy surface, my reflection seemed off. It was subtle at first. A tilt of the head I didn't make, a slight delay in its movements. The next morning I went earlier, hoping to catch the lake before anyone else. As I glided over the frozen surface, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I stopped and looked around. The figure was there again, closer this time. It was faceless. No eyes, no mouth, just a blank, pale oval where a face should have been. My heart pounded as I stumbled backward, nearly falling. The figure didn't move, but the ice beneath me groaned, the sound echoing like a warning. I turned and skated away as fast as I could, but I swear I felt its gaze, or whatever it had, in the back of my head. By the third day, I was too scared to go alone, so I brought my friend Lisa. We joked about it on the way there, laughing at how silly I'd been, but when we stepped onto the ice, the laughter stopped. The air felt thick, suffocating. Lisa skated ahead, her blades slicing through the eerie silence. That's when she screamed. I turned to see her standing frozen in place, staring at the ice. My blood ran cold as I followed her gaze. Beneath the surface, shadows writhed like living things, their shapes human but distorted. One of them reached up, a hand pressing against the underside of the ice. We ran off the lake, but I couldn't stay away. Something about it pulled me back. The next morning, I returned alone. The figure was waiting for me. This time, it mirrored my every move. When I spun, it spun. When I fell, it fell, but harder, cracking the ice beneath it. I stared in horror as the crack spiderwebbed outward, creeping toward me. "Who are you?" I whispered. My voice trembled, barely audible. It didn't answer. Instead, it tilted its head, a mocking echo of my movements. The ice groaned again, louder this time, and I felt the ground beneath me shift. I skated toward the shore, but the figure followed, its movements faster now, more aggressive. My reflection in the ice no longer looked like me. Its eyes, yes, it had eyes now, were wide and hungry, its mouth twisted into a cruel grin. I didn't make it to the edge. The ice gave way beneath me with a deafening crack, plunging me into the freezing water. I gasped, the cold stealing my breath as I clawed at the surface. Above me, the figure stood, peering down through the ice. Its blank face was the last thing I saw before everything went black. When they found me hours later, unconscious on the shore, they said it was a miracle I'd survived. But I know the truth. The figure let me go, and it's waiting for me to come back. It was a bitter December night when the first knock came. I was sitting by the fireplace in my tiny cabin, tucked away near the frozen lake, trying to ignore the eerie silence that always seemed heavier this time of year. The wind howled outside, but the knock was unmistakable. Slow, deliberate, and heavy. I froze, the warmth of the fire suddenly doing nothing to stop the chill crawling up my spine. Nobody ever came out this far. Not at night. Not in winter. My nearest neighbor lived a mile away. Still, I told myself it could be a lost traveler, maybe someone stranded by the storm. I wrapped a blanket around me and shuffled to the door. When I opened it, I immediately wished I hadn't. A man stood there, or at least what used to be a man. His skin was pale blue, frostbitten, and cracked like porcelain. Ice clung to his beard, and his clothes were stiff with frost. His eyes, lifeless milky white, stared straight into mine. He smiled, his lips cracked and bleeding. "Please," he whispered, his voice hoarse and brittle, like the crunch of boots on fresh snow. "It's so cold. Let me in." My instinct screamed at me to slam the door, but my body wouldn't move. His presence felt wrong, like something out of a nightmare. Then I noticed the water pooling at his feet, spreading slowly over my porch, despite the below-freezing temperature. "I can't," I stammered, finally finding my voice. His smile widened, splitting his frozen skin. For a moment I thought I saw something move under his icy flesh. A shadow, writhing and twisting. Without a word, he turned and trudged back toward the lake, his heavy boots crunching against the snow. I slammed the door and locked it, but sleep didn't come that night. The next morning, I found wet footprints leading from my porch all the way to the frozen lake. They stopped abruptly at the edge where the ice was cracked, as if something had climbed out. I told myself it had to be my imagination. Stress, maybe. But then I heard about Mrs. Cullen. She lived alone, on the other side of the lake. The mailman found her door wide open the next morning, but she was gone. Inside, the walls were coated in frost, and her dining room table was set for two, though she lived alone. The strange part? Water was dripping from the ceiling, as though something had melted there. By the end of the week, more people had vanished. Every story was the same. A knock in the night. A frostbitten stranger begging to come in. Those who opened their doors were never seen again. I started to notice things too. Dark shapes moving under the frozen surface of the lake. Faint voices carried by the wind. One night I heard my father's voice outside my door. He's been dead for 3 years. "It's me, son," he called. "I'm so cold. Please let me in." I didn't move. My father would never call me son. The knocking lasted for hours that night, soft but relentless. I stayed curled up by the fireplace, clutching a knife, knowing it wouldn't help if they got in. By the end of the month, half the village was gone. The last time I saw the frozen ones was 2 nights ago. I watched from my window as they rose from the lake, dozens of them, their icy forms glowing faintly in the moonlight. They stood there motionless as if waiting for something. Then one by one they turned toward the village and began walking. Now, it's quiet. Too quiet. The lake outside is still frozen, but I know they're under there waiting for next December. And tonight I heard the knock again.